Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to PNP Live. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of Politics and Prose, along with my wife, Lissa Muscatine, and we have a very informative event for you this afternoon featuring Wesley Morgan and his new book about the war in Afghanistan, The Hardest Place. Here's the cover. A couple of brief housekeeping notes first, though. To post a question at any point during the event, just click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screens. The chat function also will be active, though for comments, not questions. And in that column, you'll find a link for purchasing copies of The Hardest Place. Wes is a military affairs reporter who most recently covered the Pentagon for Politico. The Hardest Place is his first book, and it's an ambitious and comprehensive effort to try to explain America's military involvement in Afghanistan by focusing on what U.S. forces did and failed to do in one crucial region of Afghanistan, the Pech Valley and its surroundings, an area of exceptionally rugged mountainous terrain that's been the site of constant U.S. military activity and some of the toughest fighting for nearly 2 decades. Wes first visited the Pech in 2010 while he was still a college student. He embedded with military units as a freelancer. He found few of the U.S. forces there able to explain why their remote outposts had been built. And that set him on a path that not only to unravel the history of America's role in Afghanistan over the previous decade, but through subsequent reporting trips and many interviews, he went on to chronicle the U.S. military's evolving strategy, missteps, and setbacks through still almost another decade. Now, Wes's book is especially timely now that President Biden has ordered the withdrawal of remaining U.S. forces from Afghanistan. Kirkus called the book required reading for anyone who wants to understand the war in Afghanistan. And Publishers Weekly praised The Hardest Place as a definitive portrait of the epicenter of America's longest war, noting not only Wes's extensive research and insightful analysis, but also his vivid writing and deft character sketches. In conversation with Wes this afternoon will be veteran journalist Martha Raddatz, herself an expert in military and strategic affairs. Martha is a chief global affairs correspondent at ABC News, where she's been for more than 20 years. During her long and distinguished journalistic career, she's reported from the Pentagon, the State Department, the White House, and conflict zones around the world. She's also the author of The Long Road Home, a best-selling book about a battle in Iraq. So Wes and Martha, the screen is yours.
Great, thank you so much, Brad, and thank you, Wes. And I want to say right away that I wrote about a battle, you wrote about an entire war, a decades-long conflict. It is really an extraordinary book, and vivid is the best word that I've seen to describe it, because you are sucked right in, not only to the really brilliant research, but just the storyline. I met Wes by chance on occasion in Afghanistan. And I think we were just talking a few minutes ago, I think that I remember him mostly because he was so young. And I thought, what the heck is this guy doing out here, taking all these chances and in this very dangerous area? And then, of course, as he would be the first to point out, he was older than a lot of the soldiers and Marines and others who were there in the battle zone. So that to me is also a unique perspective. I was also pretty convinced he was with the agency, which he is not. But Wes, it is really an extraordinary work. And when I first read it, and I want you to talk a little bit more about the terrain. The terrain, I could describe it, but you do it so beautifully. I mean, Afghanistan is this beautiful hills and mountains. I actually grew up in Utah, so it always reminds me of flying. Kabul always reminded me of flying into Salt Lake City until I got on the ground, and then it didn't at all. But the Pech Valley is so rugged and so stark and so sharp. It is just completely different. And I remember one of the first times I went to one of those outposts, a general later said, I just don't know what we're doing there. I mean, we are just magnets, and the people who are in those hills and those mountains know that terrain better than anybody. So just start out, Wes, and your own journey and how the heck you were doing this at age 22 and had been freelancing for a couple of years. We're at Princeton, and how they let you. I always felt like it was really hard to get an embed, but then there you were.
Well, I think it was easier for one individual person than for a TV crew, because I only took up one helicopter spot, so it was a pretty easy sell. But I was taking advantage of a system that has largely fallen by the wayside now, the embedding system that put journalists from everything from big national outlets to freelancers to people from local newspapers that had guard units deployed from their communities and so on. It really gave pretty extraordinary frontline access to large parts of the war. I mean, most U.S. units were pretty accessible to journalists at this time through the embedding program. And it was a great way for a young freelancer starting out to get into the war and start to see it without some of the overhead costs that accumulate, doing it in other ways, unembedded, which is an equally important and sometimes more important perspective that I became familiar with later after I had sort of done the embedding thing to start out with. But so this was my second trip to Afghanistan was in the summer of 2010 when I used to run into you out in the East sometimes. And what I was doing that summer was I was just bouncing around from different unit to different unit, visiting, because it was the summer of President Obama's surge that General McChrystal and then General Petraeus were heading up, where all these U.S. forces were flooding into the country. Over the past couple of years, the number of U.S. troops in the country had tripled from about 30,000 to nearly 100,000. And so I was just going and visiting different battalions that were in tough areas, in tough fights. I spent some time that summer with British Marines down in Sangin, which was this IED hotspot, a chunk of time with the 101st Airborne Unit in a similar place in flat, dry, hot southern Afghanistan and Kandahar. And then one part of this summer took me to the Pech Valley, which I didn't know a whole lot about. I had read a lot of dispatches by older journalists from the Korengal Valley, which is one of the tributaries of the Pech, but I wouldn't even have really been able to, before I set out on this embed, connect these places on a map, show, where's the Korengal versus where's the Pech. But when I got there, I was just fascinated because, as you say, the terrain is really something else. It's really striking. I had spent a lot of time in Iraq up to that point, and had gotten used to these sort of the war that U.S. troops were fighting in Iraq and parts of southern Afghanistan, where you're kind of rolling through these flat expanses on roads or in agricultural fields, and sometimes engaging in firefights, but more often just patrolling and waiting to be struck by IEDs, whose triggermen you'd never see. Now, in the Pech, it was totally different. It was this jagged place with these huge sharp mountains, and there was a lot of greenery. You saw there was this lush ribbon of green agricultural field down along this very narrow valley floor. And then the farther up in the mountains you go, the more trees there were. There were these evergreen oak trees in kind of an initial lower layer of forest. And then higher up, out of sight from the valley floor, there are huge conifer forests with these soaring pines and firs and cedars, which is just not something that most people associate with Afghanistan. And when U.S. troops that I would interview later would describe, landing in clearings by helicopter up in this forest up at 7, 8, 9, 10,000 feet, they would always say it reminded them of something. I remember there was a SEAL Team 6 operator who said that it reminded him of his native Utah, like you said. Other guys will say the Pacific Northwest or the Rockies, or some guys will say it reminded them of Endor, the jungle moon in Star Wars. But it was just so different looking, and the type of fighting there was so different. There were these long distance gunfights, and so much artillery was being fired. There were these little outposts along the valley floor, and they were just sucking down contact from recoilless rifles, RPGs, all kinds of stuff that I didn't even know was necessarily in use in a modern conflict. Like recoilless rifles, I thought, that sounds like Korea, Vietnam stuff. But they were in just these long, knockdown, drag-out firefights at long ranges. And as Brad noted, you couldn't really get the troops to explain, how these outposts had been built. They knew what they were doing there. They knew what their task and purpose was of their unit at that time. But the outposts had been established early in the war, and kind of their initial purpose and when and why they'd been built kind of seemed lost to history already at that point. A company commander at Top Michigan at the mouth of the Korengal Valley would say, well, he was here when I got here. It was here when the guy before me got here. Pretty sure it was here when the guy before him got here. So, I don't know what to tell you. And that's what really got me interested is, first of all, what made this valley, the fighting in this part of the country seem so different from the parts of the war that I'd seen in other parts of the country and in Iraq. And then also, how had it gotten this way? Because it was pretty clear in the summer of 2010 that the same counterinsurgency approach that the military was rolling out all over the rest of the country had reached a stalemate and kind of failed in the Pech Valley. And the battalion commander there at the time, a guy named then Lieutenant Colonel Joe Ryan, he's now a one-star general and he's back in Kabul helping oversee the withdrawal, was pretty candid about that. Just when I sat down in his office, showing up in the valley as a freelancer he's never met before, he was pretty frank about saying, yeah, I don't think the time for expanding into new outposts in this part of the country is over. We've worn out our welcome. And that was all pretty fascinating to me.
And Wes, one of the things that I think, and I saw this too, is you have these units going in and out, but just like Joe Ryan, you say, I think he's on his eighth deployment over there.
Right.
So it's interesting to me from your perspective, and then going back, what they learn well and what, because they may keep going back or they may be new, they don't learn. I'm not convinced that we all, and the military certainly, always learned the right lessons.
Right. There's a lot that had to be relearned over and over again, because the setup was basically, not only would different units rotate, you'd have one infantry battalion would be replaced after 12 or 15 months by another infantry battalion, and then by another infantry battalion, and then by another infantry battalion. But if you zoom out and look at the scope of the war, kind of different parts of the military all had their turn up in the Pech. It started out with, very secretive special operations units in very small numbers up there. They eventually sort of lost interest in the place and turned it over to different types of special operations units. They sort of did their thing for a while. They turned it over to Marine units. The Marines turned it over to Army units. And then eventually it all wound up with these secret special operations units again, waging a drone campaign that's been going on for some years. But so there is this turnover. And you see there are individual people who come back to the same area kind of by the luck of the draw. And those people were both incredibly useful resources in researching this book. And also, I think, were a real boon to the military that it had them, because there wasn't a great system in place for these lessons to be passed down, particularly between special operations units to conventional units, between Marines to Army, and a lot got lost in these transitions. Sometimes I would be amazed to find a unit describing how they had figured out that they could use their TOW or Javelin anti-tank missiles almost as like a very expensive sniper rifle to hit enemy machine gun positions up in the mountains. And this would be sort of an ad hoc solution that they had hit upon. But of course, it was an ad hoc solution that another unit 3 years before had also hit upon, and another unit before that. So you would see this reinvention of the wheel over and over and over again.
And I want you to go back to where you begin in the book, essentially, which is at the beginning of the war. And obviously you can't, in the time we have allotted, kind of walk through, but what do you see as the stages of this war? And if you can kind of break that down just over the years, very much like you do in the book, to bring us up to the point where you embed it.
Absolutely. So I think of it as basically in 4 stages, from fall of 2001 when 9/11 happens to pretty much the present day. Maybe you could say we're in a 5th stage now, but the book covers 4 of them. So the first one, the way I think about it, is the light footprint period, when it was kind of the commandos from the Green Berets and the SEALs and the Rangers and CIA guys who were there in pretty small numbers. And what I learned in going and tracking down some of the first guys who came into the Pech Valley and the provinces that contain it, Kunar and Nuristan provinces, is that what drew them up there about 6 months after 9/11 in the spring of 2002 was they were trying to figure out where bin Laden had gone. He had escaped from the US military during the bombardment of Tora Bora in December 2001. And the military and the CIA were trying to figure out where he'd gone. They were trying to pick up his trail again. And one place that they were getting reports that Arab al-Qaeda fighters had fled from Tora Bora was Kunar province, which is, the next province north of where Tora Bora had been, and in these similarly jagged mountains. Tora Bora looks a bit like the Pech. And it turns out in retrospect that they were on the money. This is where bin Laden went after Tora Bora. He went to a place called the Shegal Valley, which is right close to the Pech in Kunar. And so that's what brought the CIA and the Joint Special Operations Command up there. But they were too far behind his trail. They never really picked it up or were sure that they were on the right track, and they lost the scent. But so they go up there in 2002. They establish the first base, and then they kind of move on. They get pulled away for the war in Iraq, and Green Berets are left there, Green Berets and Marines, to kind of start trying to build local militias and figure out the lay of the land in this place. And that's sort of where the first part of the book ends, is in 2005, where you've got these Marines and Special Forces up there. It's not totally clear what they're doing to themselves or to the higher command in Kabul. There's a rising insurgency. It's not obvious who is in that insurgency, whether it's all foreigners or whether it's all locals or what. But there's a very deadly incident in 2005 in which 19 special operations troops are killed in a helicopter shoot down. And that really kicks the war into a higher gear in the Pech Valley and its surroundings. And so in the following year, 2006, this second phase of the war up there begins, when a pretty large conventional force of infantrymen from the 10th Mountain Division floods into the Pech Valley and starts building outposts. They build them not just in the Pech itself, where they start paving a road to act as a ground supply route and to help invigorate the local economy as sort of part of this nation building effort, but also into some very, very remote side valleys, like the Korengal Valley and the Weigall Valley, where people speak entirely different languages from elsewhere in Afghanistan. And so this second phase from 2006 to about 2010 is one in which the military, the army, goes all in on counterinsurgency, on combating the Taliban in this area by building little outposts and building roads. And it's this very expansive vision of nation building that they're engaged in. This proves extremely costly for the military. They lose a lot of guys up there. The terrain is really tough. Helicopters either are shot down or more often crash in tragic accidents when rotors clip trees over landing zones in mountain clearings. And there are some very serious battles in which large enemy forces, mostly of local fighters, but with some foreign fighters as well, who kind of are drawn in as well to help the local fighters, actually get inside the wire of some of these little outposts, penetrate over the perimeters and kill Americans inside their outposts. And this, eventually the military decides over the course of, new headquarters coming in, new headquarters coming in, new headquarters coming in some cases no longer really being sure why we went up there in the first place, like the general you alluded to. The military decides that it's had enough of this and it's time to start paring back this tree of this network of outposts that they have built, expanding into all these little valleys. But this proves very difficult to do. It turns out that it's much harder to close an outpost in one of these remote places than it is to build it, in part because typically when they built the outpost, it was a more permissive environment. There was less fighting. Some guys just drove up in pickup trucks. Some Marines or Green Berets would drive up in pickup trucks and set up camp somewhere. But by the time they decide to close it, by the time the 4-star commander in Kabul or the 2-star at Bagram decides, okay, yeah, we're out of this outpost, it's kind of like this fortress. Every one of these places, it takes a long time to get out of. There's a lot of deliberating and decisions over, well, we've shed blood up there. Can we really give it up? Then they do decide to leave, but then it takes mustering all these helicopters and drones and a huge logistical effort to get out of the outpost. And then sometimes they wind up getting sucked back in. And this is what part 3 of the book covers, which kind of is 2010 through 2013 or so, is this long goodbye where American forces close these outposts up in the Pech one after another, often places that they've named after fellow American soldiers who died at or near these outposts. But then in some cases gets sucked back into them because the Afghan army stays behind to try and control what the Afghan government sees as strategic territory. And in some cases, the Afghan troops aren't able to fend for themselves, and U.S. forces have to go back and reestablish a presence at a place they've already left and try and get the Afghan army back on their feet. So that's the third phase up through the last US base in Kunar province at the mouth of the Pech Valley closes in the fall of 2014. And then the fourth phase is one in which the ground war continues, but just between the Afghan government and the insurgents. US troops are no longer fighting there on the ground for the most part, with the exception of some, Ranger night raids and CIA night raids. And the US role is much more an aerial one. And what you see this phase characterized by is, in the same way that the US went up there in 2002 looking for Al-Qaeda guys but didn't find any, now there really are Al-Qaeda guys up there. There's a small number of Arab Al-Qaeda fighters have been drawn in by the ferocity of the fighting, by the opportunity to kind of prove themselves on the battlefield as advisors to the local Taliban, fighting alongside local militants. And so there's a guy who's ensconced himself up in these mountains named Furukul Katani, who is an Arab Al-Qaeda fighter who obviously never became a household name in the United States or anything like that, but he was really someone that the Obama National Security Council in the second term of the Obama administration and the CIA were very concerned about because they saw him as a potential heir to the whole Al-Qaeda enterprise. And so the Joint Special Operations Command, led by the Army Rangers, got this mission of using drones and air power to keep a lid on this place and this guy without risking Americans on the ground. And that's what this fourth phase of the war looks like, is this concerted drone campaign, an aerial manhunt, as this Special Operations Task Force tries to and eventually does kill Furukul Katani. But no sooner do they kill him than they face a new enemy, a new sort of head from the Hydra emerges, which is the Islamic State. And so in more recent years, you see the same drone campaign fighting against the Islamic State in Kunar. And then that's sort of where the book ends, is with this fight, this complicated fight up there between, you've got the government, you've got the Taliban, you've got the Islamic State. They're all up there on the ground. In some cases, the government and the Taliban are working together against the Islamic State. And then you've got, the U.S. drone campaign overhead trying to tip the scales here and there in favor of the government, sometimes even in favor of the Taliban, anything but the Islamic State. And that's where the book ends, is kind of basically about a year ago with the Doha agreement.
And I want to pick up a little later on where we are today and what you think should happen given President Biden's announcement of pulling all troops out probably within the next couple of months. But I want to touch on what you said about Al-Qaeda and ISIS as well. Are they in as far as you know, planning plots overseas and in the US anymore, in Britain, or is it really more localized now? And does that more localized mean going after US troops still?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I think it's one that the intelligence community and the military and the Biden administration are all going to have to grapple with in the months ahead, especially after they leave the country, is what does it really mean for Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State to be up in a place like Kunar? The easier one to answer kind of is the Islamic State, because what the Islamic State looks like in Kunar is very, very different from what the Islamic State looks like in Iraq or Syria or Libya. There's very little evidence that foreign fighters came in from those places to establish the new the Islamic State in Kunar. Much more what the Islamic State presence up there is it's local insurgent groups, often ones that actually fought against the Taliban before 9/11, but then joined forces with the Taliban to fight against the United States, who have similar ideologies to ISIS. Salafi Muslims who have this sort of Saudi-inspired version of Islam. It's these local Salafi groups lowering the white flag of the Taliban that they had been flying for some years and raising the black flag of ISIS. And there really is not evidence of international attack plotting from ISIS emerging from this part of Afghanistan. We know there have been international attack plots by ISIS that have emerged out of Syria, like the Bataclan theater attack in 2015 in Paris, but there's nothing comparable to that seems to have come out of this very different, much more local ISIS affiliate in Kunar and the mountains around the Pech Valley. Now, with Al-Qaeda, it's a little more complicated. The numbers of Al-Qaeda guys up there seem like they're very small. And we're talking about, Arab Al-Qaeda operatives and also local allies that they have recruited into the organization, but, pretty hardcore operatives. And they come in different flavors. And this is kind of the real trick from an intelligence collection and counterterrorism perspective, is knowing what kind of al-Qaeda you're dealing with. Because al-Qaeda has always had two missions in Afghanistan, and even before 9/11 and then during all the subsequent years. One part of the mission is an international terrorism mission, using this place to have a sanctuary to plot attacks against the West and overseas. But the other side of the al-Qaeda coin is a battlefield advising mission, in which al-Qaeda fighters almost act the way American Green Berets do. They plug themselves into local Taliban units in the same way that Green Berets plug themselves into local Afghan and Iraqi units, and they train them and advise them and teach them things and help them on the battlefield. And that's actually a big part of what we've seen al-Qaeda do up in this part of the country, and increasingly do in other parts of the country in recent years. There are these two al-Qaeda figures who come up a lot in the book. One is Furukul Katani, this one that the Obama administration was very worried about and was eventually killed in 2016. And he's someone who the intelligence community was pretty convinced that he was really involved in international attack plotting. I think a lot of the classified intelligence that went into that we probably will never see or won't see for many, many years. But what was described to me was essentially that there were worrying indicators that he was bringing in Pakistani nationals who had clean records and British visas, and EU visas, to try to bring them up into these mountains and train them for some purpose. So not something very specific, but enough of an indicator of international terrorism plotting that the military and the CIA took it very, very seriously. On the other side of the spectrum, there was a guy named Abu Ikhlas, who's an Egyptian al-Qaeda fighter who acted as almost like a magnet for the US military in the early years after 9/11, when they were trying to figure out where there were al-Qaeda guys in Afghanistan. And there were always reports of Abu Ikhlas running around the Pech Valley and its tributary valleys. And this was impossible for the military to turn down the chance to chase this guy, because there weren't very many al-Qaeda guys on the Afghan side of the border for them to chase. So Abu Ikhlas's presence really helped to draw the Americans up there, and eventually they captured him. They captured him in December 2010 in a raid. And when they interrogated him, and I was able to read some stuff from the interrogation reports for this book, he didn't turn out to be an international terrorist. He turned out to be an example of this other flavor of al-Qaeda fighter. The guy who is there to advise local forces in their fight against what they see as an illegitimate US-backed government. That was a hard distinction to make, even when we had US troops on the ground talking to locals and collecting intelligence. I think it's going to be a much harder one even to know what flavor of al-Qaeda you're dealing with a lot of the intelligence collection mechanism gone in the months and years ahead.
And Wes, I want to, you've talked a lot about intelligence, and one of the things I think most reporters who go over there do not have any relationship with the agency, don't really know who's who. I mean, obviously I thought you were, and that wasn't true, but I mean, there is sort of a wink when you know people, and there are several people I was quite certain and we're dealing with that. But you learned a lot about what the CIA was doing there and the missions they were taking on.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot we'll never know or won't know for a long time. But because I worked for so long on this book, and because the war continued to unfold as I was writing it, a lot more people came out of the woodwork to talk to me than I initially thought would. I initially thought, okay, I'm going to be telling this story of the American military involvement up there, and it seemed pretty straightforward to me. The story of one team after another team after another team, followed by a battalion after a battalion after a battalion. But there was this other layer going on in the background that was pretty invisible to me when I was a reporter embedded with these military forces a decade ago, which was kind of this hidden hand of the CIA in all of this. The conventional military forces, and by extension, reporters covering them, they knew the CIA was around. It was no secret that the CIA maintained a base at Asadabad, the provincial seat of Kunar province at the mouth of the Pech Valley, and other little bases like that in the Afghan East. But conventional forces were really very rarely clued in on what the CIA was doing there, with the exception of sometimes the CIA would come to them and ask, either okay, we have some intelligence about a target up in this valley, maybe you could go work on that. Or sometimes they would ask for things. They would ask for the military to go to a specific place, do a specific thing. And so you see the CIA kind of show up in this behind the scenes role in several places in the story over the years. Sometimes really not in a helpful way to the military. One example early on is in 2003, during the first really big operation that sends hundreds of US troops up into the Pech Valley and its very remote tributary valleys, the CIA conducts an airstrike using military assets. It essentially orders the military to execute this strike. That is really a botched strike. They're trying to kill an ally of bin Laden named Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, but he's not there. Instead, they actually kill some members of the family, women and children of the family, of a pretty key local figure who would have been a good person to have on the American side. And I sort of unraveled a little bit of the story of how this happened. It seems like CIA officers were essentially tricked and played by their local sources who were trying to settle a grudge, perhaps. But what this did was, because this event happened, and then because it was kind of concealed, it happened behind the veil of top secret classification. Then when conventional US infantrymen showed up in this same valley, the Weigel Valley, a few years later, they, one, didn't really know that this event had happened. They would hear about it from local Afghans who had been involved, but they didn't know what to believe and what not to believe. And two, they were saddled with the aftermath of this event. I mean, they were starting from, further back than square one, basically, because they were working from this deficit where people already had this experience with America, where US aircraft had come in and killed a bunch of innocent people. And so this sort of bitterness over this event was lying in wait, almost like a booby trap for these first American infantrymen to go marching around and building outposts up there. The other place where you see the CIA role is in 2006, when the 10th Mountain Division did this big plunge up into the valleys and started doing all of its outpost building and road building. We know now that a part of why they did that was at the behest of the CIA. The CIA thought at the time that Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri, his deputy, were likely in some parts of Pakistan that are right across the border from this area of Afghanistan. And the CIA believed that if the military went up to this part of Afghanistan and started building outposts, this would give the CIA access to new sources, to merchants and smugglers and so on, who passed back and forth between that part of Afghanistan and the relevant part of Pakistan. This didn't really pan out. Some CIA officers and military officers involved in the effort described this to me as kind of a dead end as far as locating bin Laden, who turned out to be in a completely different part of Pakistan. But it was part of the underlying calculus that pushed the military up into these valleys, from which the military then had a very difficult time extracting itself. And it's a kind of a behind the scenes part that often military commanders themselves, the young company commanders and battalion commanders out there fighting the war, weren't really aware of. It was stuff that had happened before their time and at a higher pay grade. But that was a pretty fascinating part to pull apart, a thread to pull on. And I'm sure there's much more of it that I wasn't able to uncover as well.
Hey, Wes, you've said this several times about them not kind of passing on these lessons and passing on all this kind of information that would be so helpful. Some of it very tactical, some of it strategic. Got a solution for that? I mean, is there something really concrete that could be done? Look, the military, for those of you who don't know, has this right seat, left seat ride. The incoming commanders spend a couple of weeks with the new guy coming in or the new woman coming in, and yet what you say is that doesn't work.
Right. No, I don't have a solution. I can point to some military units that have done a better job than others. By the nature of how they're organized and what their mission is. For example, the 75th Ranger Regiment has maintained a very persistent focus on Afghanistan for almost the entire period of this war. And because of the way the regiment is organized, it's able to kind of just rotate the same 3 battalions through the country, one after another, after another, after another. And so those 3 battalions are much more all on the same page as each other, and they share lessons much better than, say, random infantry brigades from different parts of the army that go there and never go back to the same place. So that's one. I think the Ranger Regiment is an example of a place where there has been more institutional knowledge. Although even in the Ranger Regiment, it's a young organization. Officers in particular rotate through there really fast. There are lots of young officers who go there for a few years and then leave. And the military in general is this kind of forever young organization, right? I mean, everybody is constantly turning over. So in some sense, it seems like a fool's errand to, how much knowledge can you possibly retain in an organization where everybody is always perpetually, 24 years old?
Although I got to interrupt you there. I feel like I have seen all those 24-year-olds go through an age. I mean, and one of the things that struck me about the book is clearly, I mean, obviously it's a young person's military, but a lot of the people who were in Iraq ended up in Afghanistan. There were very familiar names to me, and Gary Valesky and Mark Milley, and who's now the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. When they went from Iraq, and I have a very good question that I'm going to ask you after this from Eleanor Backrack, but I want the lessons they thought they learned in Iraq. How much did that help or hurt in Afghanistan when you had these people going from that battleground that just wasn't the same as the one in Afghanistan?
Yeah, I think in many cases, those were lessons that had to be unlearned, the lessons of Iraq for units that then went over to Afghanistan. A battalion that, I'll give the example of the 132 Infantry Battalion, which was the first one to spread out in all these little outposts in 2006, 2007. They had done a previous tour in Iraq that looked completely different in every way from what they wound up doing in Afghanistan. They had been driving around, kind of doing this highways and city neighborhoods war of Humvees. And their battalion commander, a guy who now is the 4-star U.S. general in Europe, General Christopher Cavoli, he basically looked at this unit and said, we're going to have to ditch all this Iraq experience because where we're going, Humvees are not going to cut it. This is going to be we're going to be walking on our feet. And so I think it took, it sometimes took a lot of kind of willpower from leaders to impose on units, hey, forget about that. The lessons you've learned in X situation are not applicable to Y situation. But the flip side of that is that, as you say, there are leaders who have aged upward and been promoted in this army through this experience who do have relevant experience. And some of those guys, I think, it's what I hope that the Army is able to do is leverage that experience and ensure that they continue to be assigned to jobs where they'll be able to use it, rather than kind of bouncing them around from theater to theater in a way where their knowledge isn't applicable. I mean, I'll give the example of there was a company commander in the Pech named Lauren Crow in 2011, 2012, who had previously been a lieutenant there. And he'd earned a Silver Star in combat for valor in combat as a lieutenant there in 2008, 2009. And he came back and he really was able to, in some ways, shed some of the bad behavior that his previous unit had participated in, kind of the emphasis on big offensive operations, going up and searching for the enemy in the hills. He had been there and done that and seen that it didn't work. And so when he was a company commander in the Pech, he was able to kind of on day one say, hey, what we're doing is we're building up the Afghan National Army. It's not as satisfying. It's not as thrilling as these big air assaults up into the mountains, but it's the only thing that might work. Now, his unit didn't always incorporate those lessons, and sometimes his broader unit ignored them. But within his company, he was able to make that stick. So I think there are plenty of instances of officers who kept going back, either through their own efforts, they wanted to go back to the same place and they found some way to do it, or just more often just through the luck of the draw. And they, applied their personal knowledge to these situations. Now, so I think if the Army can institutionalize that in some way, the Army is unfortunately doing away with a unit that is really a hero of the story. There's a unit called the Asymmetric Warfare Group, which was a unit of basically old guys in Army terms, pretty senior, often retired special operations troops who were back as contractors, who would keep going back to the same part of the country over and over again. And they would sort of try to spread the knowledge into these new units. And those guys saved lives. The Asymmetric Warfare Group played an incredibly important role in the war in Eastern Afghanistan. Unfortunately, as the Army is shifting to, preparing for other kinds of conflicts with Russia or China, and as it's tightening its belt and cutting costs, it has discontinued the Asymmetric Warfare Group, which, to be fair, had already changed, I think, quite a bit from the way it looked, 10 years ago. But I think units like that are things that the Army, I would hope, focuses on, especially as we face the prospect of, we're pulling out. I mean, who knows? American forces may be back to Afghanistan. They left Iraq in 2011, and it wasn't that much longer that they were back. And personal knowledge is great, you know, having guys who've been there before. But depending on how long it is before that happens, you may not be able to rely on that personal knowledge. And so I would certainly hope that the military is able to, in some way, store the lessons of Afghanistan rather than just dropping them.
Okay, and I want to take some questions from people out there. And Eleanor Backrack, who I said had asked this question, I wanted to, how do you think the war in Afghanistan might have gone if Bush hadn't changed the focus to Iraq and away from the real connection to 9/11?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, you do see a real tangible example of that shift in Afghanistan, in this part of the country where the Joint Special Operations Command guys, SEAL Team 6 and the Rangers, they're up running around in Kunar in the fall of 2002 trying to pick up bin Laden's trail when basically they get told, okay, new war, to pull out of this country, especially the Rangers, and get ready for Iraq. Now, I don't know how much it would have mattered had they stayed. I mean, because I think at that point they had sort of already lost bin Laden's trail. It's conceivable that, you know, if the special operations effort had continued uninterrupted rather than being interrupted as it was in 2003, that perhaps they could have caught bin Laden more quickly. I think that's probably I don't think you can count on that in sort of this realm of alternate histories. And I also think there is, you know, you can see a situation where by not going into Iraq and focusing completely on Afghanistan, we could have just gotten into the same big mess earlier, right? We could have, if we had just sort of poured 100,000 troops into Afghanistan in 2005 at the first sign of a broad-based insurgency, that might not have been a good thing. That might have simply been, you know, doing earlier what we did later in terms of doing a big surge that turns out not to be sustainable.
Okay, and here's one from James Donnellan, who says, you and I spoke about 2/3 of the time in Kunar in 2005 and 2006. My second tour was in RC Southwest, which was totally different indeed. General McChrystal and others put a lot of stock in the AFPAC HANDS program, trying to develop the cultural understanding and language skills to operate there. This is that, you know, sort of counterinsurgency coin sort of thing too, but we never got our personnel policies refined enough to consistently get second tours in the same place. It's a little bit what we're talking about. Do you think we could have achieved anything differently had we gotten this right?
This Jim actually appears in the book. He was the commander of the 2-3 Marine Battalion that was on the ground during Operation Red Wings in 2005. I think that's a great question. And I think that's one where the answer is maybe if we'd started a lot earlier. I think programs like AFPAC HANDS, or, you know, there was a while when the Army really had it in its head that it wanted to send the same brigades back to the same parts of the country. But it was kind of, it just felt like it was too little too late. You know, by the time AFPAC HANDS was really up and running, U.S. forces were already on the downswing in terms of being out in the districts every day. And so I think the underlying flaw that would have made all of those programs very difficult to really make more successful was that it's only possible for those things to work if you're thinking pretty far ahead. And I think at no point in the war has the U.S. military really been thinking, okay, we're going to be here for 10 more years. Let's dig in and get this right. And I think it's always has felt like, hey, success is around the corner. We're not going to be at this much longer. And that has always undermined any of those kind of long-term efforts.
And yet I have to say, like in particularly in training the Afghan military, I feel like I went back year after year after year. I remember when Bill Caldwell, it was probably 12, 13 years ago, was there and saying, they can't drive, they can't read, they can't shoot. And 3 years later, pretty much the same thing over and over and over and over again. So it's almost like there was that sense there, but they weren't really saying it was true. You know, there was a sense they'd be there a long time, but they were in denial.
Right. I think that denial is a big part of it. I think also, when it comes to training the Afghans, one thing that has really hobbled, you see this in the course of the book and in the war in Kunar, is the military tried to build an Afghan army kind of in its own image. And that really didn't prove very effective. I mean, there are certain small elements of the Afghan military where that has worked, commando units and special operations units, where building them into something like a mirror image of US units has been successful, but it hasn't scaled. These Afghan infantry units, they don't work like American U.S. Army or Marine conventional infantry units. And yet that's sort of what the military tried year after year after year to do, was to make them work like U.S. Army or Marine infantry units, rather than kind of letting them fight the war as they want to fight it, which I think maybe is something that could have yielded perhaps not the kind of success that American policymakers and generals were envisioning, but perhaps something a little more realistic and sustainable than the very static Afghan force that we see today that's just bleeding casualties constantly all the time as it just gets hammered at its little checkpoints all over the country. Sorry, Martha, you're muted. You're muted, Martha. I can't hear you.
Sorry, my space bar was not working. I should have been unmuted. I want to talk about now and what's happening, whether you were surprised by President Biden's announcement and what you think about that, and talk about also just the intelligence, because we had Bill Burns saying we are not going to be being able to gather as much intelligence. You know that, I know that. Obviously, he knows that. So talk about the pullout, the surprise, and particularly focus on how you do counterterrorism if you don't have a presence there.
Yeah, I mean, as far as surprise, I think it's perhaps easy to be surprised in some sense if you just feel like this was never going to happen. We've been through this so many times before, where an administration thought said it was going to pull out, but then wasn't able to. But it was going to happen eventually. And I think General Miller in Kabul had a pretty good sense that this might be the time, either under the Trump administration or the Biden administration. So I would say, yeah, I wasn't really surprised by it. I mean, especially with the background of the Doha process, I almost would have been more surprised had the Biden administration said, well, we're scrapping all that. We're scrapping the drawdown and the withdrawal. I mean, it would have been really surprising to see them recommit in any substantive way. That just seemed like something that wasn't in the cards. And we talk about intelligence. I mean, and yes, as Director Burns testified on the same day that President Biden made his announcement, he testified two things that I think have to be considered at once. One, he testified that he doesn't think, and it's the CIA's estimate, that Al-Qaeda and ISIS in Afghanistan don't pose an international terrorism threat. They don't have the capability to launch attacks internationally. But he also said our intelligence is going to be degraded post-withdrawal. So if that changes, if Al-Qaeda or ISIS do gain the capability to launch attacks, from within Afghanistan, will we know? One thing that I would throw out there is that I think our intelligence has already been degraded pretty significantly in Afghanistan, and that we may be in some ways already living with the reality that we're all talking about and wondering about. The U.S. military presence is so small already; it has shrunk down to this handful of bases. The number of drone orbits that are flying over the country at any given time, the amount of human intelligence that's being collected by troops out in the field is so negligible compared to what it was 10 years ago that I think in some ways we are much closer into the future intelligence picture that we can be, expecting in a year from now than we are to the intelligence picture that we had back when there were little CIA outstations in every province along the border. And that's, with that comes the question of, well, how do we know where Al-Qaeda is? And if we do know where Al-Qaeda is, how do we know what they're up to? How do we know if they're flavor 1 of Al-Qaeda that's planning international terrorist attacks, or if they're flavor 2 of Al-Qaeda that's focused on enabling and assisting the Taliban in its war against the government? And how much overlap is there between these two flavors of Taliban? There's, these are questions that it's going to be really, really hard to answer. And they're probably not going to be able to answer purely through aerial intelligence collection that I think it looks like we're probably going to have to fall back on, and is itself going to be a much more difficult task without airfields within the country to fly drones and other surveillance craft out of.
And I want to remind people that they can go into the Q&A section here. And I also want to drill down just a little bit more on Al-Qaeda. We've talked about it a lot. Do you believe that Al-Qaeda is strong in Afghanistan, that they'll reemerge when the US pulls out? I mean, we really don't hear a lot about Al-Qaeda anymore. I know Zawahiri, which I think people forget, is still presumably out there somewhere. But the strength of Al-Qaeda there.
I think we don't know, in part because the intelligence picture is so diminished as the U.S. presence has shrunk. We know that Al-Qaeda is there. We know that Al-Qaeda operatives are popping up either in propaganda videos or when Afghan special forces capture or kill them in parts of the country where 10 years ago they weren't there. There are Al-Qaeda operatives who get killed in Ghazni province south of Kabul or in Helmand. So they're in more places than back at the height of things when they were pretty concentrated in Kunar and Nuristan and the areas around the Pech Valley, and that was what drew U.S. forces up there. But as for what that means for their strength, I think that's a much harder question to answer, and one that I think frankly the CIA is going to have to rely pretty heavily on its own Afghan partners, the Afghan National Director of Security, to answer that question, who themselves are an ally with a vested interest in how they present the answer to that question, right? I mean, the more and more dangerous of the Al-Qaeda threat that they can present, the more American support they can probably sell or pitch the CIA on. So that's the thing that presumably the agency is scrambling now to figure out is how are we going to maintain an intelligence picture in Taliban-controlled areas of Afghanistan without as much surveillance and as much signals intelligence and so on. I think it's a really tough question. And I think the answer is that the Biden administration is going to have to assume and is assuming a degree of risk in terms of what is Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and how strong it is. But I think part of why it's assuming that risk is because the picture of what Afghanistan means to Al-Qaeda is very different today from what it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago, right? I mean, at the time of 9/11, Afghanistan really was Al-Qaeda's one territorial stronghold. But that's not the case today. And there's an Al-Qaeda affiliate that controls large portions of the city of Idlib in Syria. There are Al-Qaeda affiliates that own ground in Yemen, and Al-Shabaab in Somalia controls large chunks of the country and is affiliated with Al-Qaeda and is believed to have been involved in international attack plotting over the past couple of years. So the question of how much does Afghanistan mean to Al-Qaeda, I think is very different today. And it may be that it doesn't mean that much to them in terms of a place to plot attacks from when they have all these other lily pads and strongholds. And when everybody is so much more networked now, there are all these encrypted communications that people could communicate with from one corner of the planet to another. So I think, the question of kind of what does territorial control mean to Al-Qaeda? It seems like one that the Biden administration is weighing in and saying, well, not as much.
Was I muted again there, Wes? Sorry.
Right.
Sometimes this spacebar works and sometimes it doesn't. Talk about the Taliban and what you think will happen in Afghanistan, about what we all are concerned about, the young women and education and what the Taliban does.
I don't have much in the way of good answers for that, because the area of the country that I've focused on is one that is really not the Taliban heartland. The Taliban was not really up in Kunar and Nuristan provinces before 2001 to any great extent. And it only came up there in part as a result of U.S. intervention, which drew the Taliban in and gave it an opening to take over the local insurgency up there. I think we know that up in Kunar and Nuristan, we know that it's not really that much of strategic terrain for the Taliban in the way that big cities around the country are, or the way that its opium processing and poppy growing heartland in the south of the country is. So I don't think we can expect Kunar and Nuristan to be kind of the big battlefield in the years ahead in the way that it sometimes has been in the past. But because of this unusual situation up there where ISIS has been playing the spoiling role in that part of the country, we actually have seen the Taliban and the government reach local accommodations with one another that one might hope could play out in other parts of the country, depending on different circumstances if the peace process goes forward. One thing that you see in the Pech Valley is you see the Taliban actually, especially when the Taliban and the government were both fighting against ISIS, you'd see the Taliban continuing to pay the salaries of government, I mean, not pay the salaries, but continue to allow the government to pay the salaries of teachers and clinic workers and so on in Taliban-controlled territory.
And Wes, I'm going to stop you here because we're almost out of time. And this is my last question, and I want to read it. And we really just have a couple of minutes here. Remind everyone to buy this book. It is sensational. Jeff Wyatt says, after finishing your book, I would have liked a bit more of your personal experiences, first person versus third person. Was that a deliberate choice by you when you wrote it?
Yes, it was. I think my instincts told me not to have any first person in there at all, because I didn't see myself as the story. I mean, I was only there for little bits and pieces. I only saw bits and pieces of it firsthand. I wound up deciding that some of that first person perspective was valuable to set the scene in the prologue, to describe through my own eyes kind of the monster that the Pech had evolved into by 2010, and to describe in some cases my interactions with guys that I was talking to, my interview subjects, and some of the subsequent trips that I made up there. So I'm flattered that somebody wants more of my perspective, but I think I stick with my choice not to provide it, because the book is not about me. I'm the least interesting person in the book in many ways.
You're pretty darn interesting, Wes, and we thank you very, very much. And what an amazing feat for someone who first started going over there in his 20s.
Thank you
Thanks,
so much.
guys.
Great moderating, Martha. And Wes, you know, whether or not the U.S. military has figured out how to pass on the important lessons that should have been learned in Afghanistan, your richly detailed book certainly will help ensure the history of that long war won't be forgotten. You know, I have to ask though about that stack of books next to you. What's the significance of that? Have you run out of shelves there?
Well, I will. It looks like a stack, but it's actually a shelf. If I pull this out, nothing will fall.
Oh, there you go. Okay, yeah, I was holding my breath.
Got a little apartment, and I got to make use of the what space I've got.
Yeah, well, it's a nice feature to stack books that way rather than the way we typically see them. To everyone watching, thanks for tuning in. A reminder that in the chat column, you can find a link for purchasing copies of The Hardest Place. From all of us here at Politics and Prose, stay well and well read.